morning. You guys doing okay? All right. Hey, if you've got your Bible, turn to Acts 27. So if you've got your Bible or a phone with the Bible app on it, if you do have the Bible app by you version, you probably know this if you've been around for a while, but you can go to the little three dots, choose events, search for Cane Bay, and you'll see our notes, the notes for today's message loaded in there. That's a way you can follow along as well. You can write on the back of your program, but I'd love for you to follow along. Today we are starting this series called The Journey. You see it on the front of your program, you see it behind me. And really what this is this is the last series we are doing in the book of Acts. So we are about to finish the book of Acts. So for 2 years, for almost 2 years, our church has been walking through the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is really the story of what happened after Jesus died and was resurrected and then ascended to heaven at the beginning of the book of Acts. And the people who believed and followed him spread all over the world, giving their lives for Jesus. And so the gospel of Jesus, or the good news of Jesus, begins to spread and multiply. And it's crazy. We are still living in the wake of the book of Acts. In fact, you're going to see in the series how when it ends, it doesn't really end. The book of Acts ends in these, over the next 4 weeks, we're going to do Acts 27 and 28, and then it'll end, but it doesn't really end. Why? Because it's not over. The story's not done. We're still spreading. The gospel of Jesus is still multiplying. His kingdom is still expanding. And so it's interesting how the book of Acts ends without an end. It's like a cliffhanger. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks. Now, these last 2 chapters, what happens is they describe the transfer of Paul, who was really at this time the greatest missionary for Jesus. He's going all over the known world at the time, the northern Mediterranean world. He had started tons of churches and written lots of letters to those churches, encouraging them. And so the Christianity is spreading all over the place, and Paul was a big part of that. And then Paul's arrested. Now, Paul had been arrested many times, thrown in prison for his faith. But at this point, he has been in jail for several years, awaiting trial, and he's had hearings in front of multiple officials and people. He stood trial before the king of Judea and the Roman governor, and now he's appealed for his case to be heard by the emperor. So the Roman Empire is where Paul lived. He was actually a Roman citizen, so he had the right to appeal. It's kind of like appealing to the Supreme Court. And that's what Paul does. And so now he's awaiting to go. And in these last 2 chapters, we see he's finally sent. He's finally sent to Rome to stand trial before the emperor. And what you're going to see today and next week and the next week is that he goes through a storm. He's shipwrecked in the Mediterranean. He's snake bitten on the island of Malta. And then the book of Acts ends with him being under house arrest in the largest city in the world at the time, in Rome. The story isn't finished and we're left hanging, and that's because we just said our story isn't over yet. Followers of Jesus are still on mission. And here's the thing, this is why we're calling this The Journey, is because our lives are not just about the destination. I mean, one day, yes, we will, if you believe and follow Jesus, you will get to spend eternity with God forever. You were made for eternal purposes. But here's the thing, your life is not just about the destination, it's about the journey, the in-between. God's at work today in your life. And today matters. And what you're going to see is through all the ordinary and difficult moments of your life and Paul's life too, we might be on a journey and God's right in the middle of the journey. Don't miss what God is doing. Now, when we were in the book of Acts back in August, Paul had spent several years in prison, and now he's on his way to Rome. And that's where we're going to pick up Acts 27, verse 1. He's on his way to stand trial before the emperor of the largest empire in the world at this time, in the largest city in the world. Acts 27, verse 1 says this, "And when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius." All right, so Paul's right there, and let's figure out the context of what's going on here. I want you to notice in this verse, it says, "And when it was decided that we," Well, who's the we here? Anybody remember who's the writer of the book of Acts? Luke. That's right. So Luke, he was a physician. He was a historian. He wrote the Gospel of Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He wrote that. And this is kind of volume 2 of Luke's Gospel. It's the story of the church of Jesus, and Luke is the writer of it. He compiled all the history together. He's also a friend of Paul, a travel companion of Paul. He was the one who went with Paul in many places to start these churches. And obviously, for some reason, at this point, he's either allowed to accompany Paul on this voyage, on this trip to Rome, or he's in prison with him, but he's with Paul. He says, we. And now Paul's headed to Rome after almost 30 years of following Jesus. And Paul always had a dream. So think about this for a minute. Paul always had a dream. If you follow his missionary journeys, he would leave what we know today as Israel, Judea, and he would head across the northern Mediterranean through Turkey and Greece. And he always had a dream to take the gospel of Jesus to Rome, to Italy, and to the rest of Europe. He probably never dreamed it would happen as a prisoner this way. But God was in the middle of his journey. Look at verse 2. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, there's going to be a lot of names that I'm going to say today, and I might really mess them up, so just give me some grace. So I'm just going to say them the way I would say them. You can say it however you want to. You say potato, I say potato. All right, and embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius, remember the soldier that was in charge of Paul, Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. See God in the middle of the journey? Just notice. All right, verse 4, and putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee or the island of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion Julius found a ship of Alexandria from Egypt sailing for Italy, and he put us on board that ship. All right, so I want you to look at this map. Look at this map for a second. So this is the journey. We just got a lot of details about where they were traveling on these ships. So if you look at the map, you see they went up from Caesarea. You see Caesarea on the coast of what we know today is Israel. It was Judea at the time. They went up from Caesarea to Sidon, and then they followed the coast along to what is the coast of what is today Lebanon and Syria and Turkey. They went around Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, huge island. You can go there today, extremely diverse population. And they landed in Myra, which is in modern day Turkey. All right, so fun fact. Do you know who one of the most famous people ever from Myra is? Anybody have any idea? Nobody? All right. Most famous person I know of from Myra, his name was Saint Nicholas. You might call him Santa Claus. All right, he was from Myra. You should read his story sometime. It was in Myra that they changed, and his story is not the night before Christmas. It's not. Saint Nicholas. Anyway, not the Coca-Cola version. In Myra, listen, sorry, I'm running rabbit trails. All right, so in Myra, St. Nicholas's home in Myra, they changed ships. They were on this one ship, and that they get on this other merchant ship from Alexandria that's headed to Rome. Now, what do you know the two largest cities of the time? Alexandria, Egypt, and Rome. This was a huge trading passage, and Paul boards a merchant ship headed with goods from Alexandria to Rome. Now, look at what happens in verse 7. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty. Notice the word difficulty because you're going to hear it again. Before I just read anymore, has your journey ever had difficulty? Okay. They arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, still the coast of Turkey at this point. And as the wind did not allow us to go further or farther, we sailed under the lee, or the island of Crete, off Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens. That's the easiest name I'll pronounce today, which was near the city of Lasea. You could still go today to this little port of Fair Havens. It's not called Fair Havens anymore, but it's where often ships will take refuge from storms. They stop there and look at verse 9. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, so difficulty, dangerous, the journey is getting hard, because even the fast was already over, so it has taken some time now. Paul advised them, verse 10, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. It's difficult. It's dangerous. And Paul says, I don't think it's going to turn out well. The ship is struggling through waters off the coast of Crete. They came to a little place called Fair Havens, and Paul says there, guys, if we venture forward, if we venture out from this place, I don't think we're going to make it. I don't think this is going to end well. But look at verse 11. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Well, of course he did. He's the Roman soldier in charge of this prisoner transfer. And of course he listened to the owner of the ship and the captain of the ship more than he listened to Paul. I would have too, probably, wouldn't you? Little did he know who he was traveling with. Not only was Paul a seasoned traveler who had been in this world for 27 years and 3 shipwrecks, he has some experience here. He also didn't realize that this guy was the greatest missionary the world had ever known, a follower of Jesus, and would write most of the New Testament. He had no idea. To him, he was just a prisoner. And this owner, the owner of the ship, the captain of the ship, they had cargo to deliver to the most important city in the world. And money talks and business calls, and he has a job to do. And sometimes, I just want to stop and tell you, sometimes we head into danger and difficulty when God's saying, slow down and stop and listen, because you're headed in a direction where there's danger and difficulty ahead. And you might want to take a break, and you might want to look around you and see that there's somebody God put in your path you need to pay attention to. You with me? Maybe today, I'm just saying, maybe today you are headed into a storm that could be avoided if you listen to what God is saying. But sometimes you have to stop, take a break, and wait on the Lord. That's not what happens here. They head on, verse 12. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the whole winter in, the majority, they put it up for a vote, the majority decided of the crew to put out to sea from there, and on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. They're pressing on to another port around the end of Crete. If you look at the island of Crete, Phoenix is more toward the west end of the island, and they're headed there to spend the winter there. But look at what happens, verse 13. When they leave Fair Havens, off the south side of Crete, it says, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. They were trying to stay close to the shore to buffer the wind. Verse 14, but soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck down from the land. How many of you lived in the northeastern United States before? You know what a nor'easter is? It's not a good thing, right? You're going to get a lot of snow. Like All right, in the winter. And this is the same kind of storm. It's a nor'easter that's coming. It strikes down from the island of Crete or comes off the shore. In verse 15, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, when they couldn't head into the wind, it says we gave way to it and were driven along. They could do nothing but just let the wind take them. Verse 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty, there's that word again, to secure the ship's boat. In other words, they were able to secure the ship from falling apart, the boat part. Verse 17, after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, which were like sandbars off the island, off the coast of Cyrene in North Africa, they decided to lower the gear and they were driven along. Verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. They've lowered the gear. They're jettisoning the cargo. Do you know what jettisoning means? It's throwing off, casting off. They're tossing overboard the cargo. You see the desperation here. The cargo, the stuff they're supposed to be carrying from Alexandria to Rome, they start throwing it overboard. And then look at verse 19. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. I mean, isn't it interesting that Luke says this? With their own hands. I mean, what else would they have thrown it over with? It's kind of, but notice he's saying they did that. This is how desperate they were. They threw over the cargo, and now they're throwing over the tackle, the instruments, the things that they need to survive the voyage. They're tossing it over the side. It's a desperate moment. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that sometimes when you're in the middle of the storm, the things that we have collected and clung to don't seem nearly as valuable anymore in the moment? It's amazing what we're willing to let go of when we're in the middle of the storm. Our priorities start to change. You've been there, right? You've been there. Me too. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. That's a pretty rough statement, isn't it? You ever been there? In a situation where you just felt like it's not going to get better. Just felt like maybe the light couldn't get through. And day after day, all you see around you is darkness or failure or regret or chaos. It just feels like there's no possibility for things to improve. Maybe that circumstance for you was a health crisis that you went through or you're still going through. Maybe it was a marriage that fell apart. Maybe it was family dysfunction. Maybe it was finances. Maybe it was a habit or an addiction, a breakup, an attack or abuse that happened to you, a mistake you made. Maybe it was anxiety or depression or an emotional struggle and you don't know what caused it, but it was on you and you were covered in darkness. And maybe you're in the middle of it right now and you're sitting here listening to me and you go, I don't know if it's going to get better. One time, Jesus and his closest friends were in the middle of a rough storm on the Sea of Galilee. And they were terrified. It was a violent storm. The boat began to come apart. They thought they were all going to drown. The interesting thing about this time is that Jesus was asleep below deck. And they found him and they woke him up screaming. And Jesus stands up and tells the storm to stop. And all of a sudden, the wind and the waves grew calm. And all the men on the boat in that moment said this. They said, "Who is this? Who is this man that the wind and the waves obey him?" Who is this man that can stop the storm? Who has power over the wind and the waves? Much like the crew with Paul, who they didn't realize who was in the boat with them. That day, the disciples, to them, Jesus was just a teacher, a prophet maybe sent by God to show them the way. But all of a sudden they see in that moment that he is the one who has the power to cause, control, and calm the storm. When I was about 8 years old, I think, I'm not really sure, but I had a swing set in my backyard. How many of you had swing sets in your backyards? All right, so when I was a kid, this was the greatest thing, go out and play on the swing set, and my dad would come out in the yard and push me on the swing. And you can like swing yourself, but when your dad pushes you, you can go really high. And so I figured out that my dad would push me and I would say, "Higher, higher, higher." And of course, my dad could only push me so high before I'd wrap around that thing, So, but he would push me so high and it was so much fun. I loved it when my dad would push me. Friends just couldn't do the same, but my dad could push me really high. Well, one day, there was a kid from down the street. I've actually talked about this kid before. His name was Michael. He was a neighborhood bully. He decided to come into my backyard, and he decided to push me while I was on the swing, and I was terrified. I was already swinging, and he came up behind me, and he started pushing me, and I couldn't jump off. I couldn't get off. I couldn't get away. I was trapped on the swing, and he was pushing me higher and higher. And in that moment, he probably wasn't pushing me nearly as high as my dad pushed me, but in that moment, I was absolutely wrecked with fear and terrified, screaming for my parents to come out. And finally, they came out, and Michael ran away. Now, what is the difference between when my dad pushed me and when Michael pushed me? You see, I trusted my dad. I trusted him. No matter how high he pushed me, no matter how scary it felt, I trusted the one who was pushing my swing. But I didn't trust Michael. I didn't want him near my swing. See, it changes your perspective when you know and trust the one who causes and controls the storm. How could Jesus sleep on a boat in the middle of a violent storm that's wrecking the boat? He knew the one who twirls the storms. He knew his dad. I wish that I could say that following Jesus and giving your life to him made life easy or comfortable or safe. But it doesn't. And I'm actually not glad. I don't want to say that because I don't think it would be best for us to avoid all the storms. I don't think it would be good for us to avoid all the difficulty and the danger and have an easy, safe, comfortable life. We know what that does. I know that that's not best for me. God knows it's not best for me. But I will tell you, I've watched person after person begin to follow Jesus only to face some really difficult days. It's the one thing Jesus promised us would happen is that the storms will come. In fact, Jesus said, here on earth, you will face many trials and sorrows. But he says, but take heart, because I'm the one who overcomes the storms. I'm the one who overcomes the world. Jesus said on another occasion, he said, come to me, all who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. He does not say, if you follow me, you won't have heavy burdens. You won't be weary. You won't have difficulty. No, he says, you will. You will. It's going to get tough. But I'm the one who has power over the storms. I'm the one who can give you rest. And while Jesus does not promise a life free from storms, he does promise that he will be with us in the middle of the storm, and we can trust him through the storm. Many of you know that a little over 10 years ago, my family moved to Ethiopia. My wife and I, with our 3 kids at the time, moved to Ethiopia as missionaries. And living in Ethiopia was an amazing experience for us. But the poverty, the hunger, and the disease, and the brokenness was overwhelming. If you've ever been in a developing country or lived in a developing country, sometimes the need is just enormous. And when you walk down the street in Ethiopia, we were living in the capital city of Addis Ababa. While stepping over homeless and diseased and hungry children every day, that begins to weigh on you. And some we could help, but some we couldn't. While we were there, we met a missionary family who had been there for almost 10 years when we arrived. Their names were Steve and Dawn Bryan. And Dawn shared with us at a point where we were tired in Ethiopia. We were kind of discouraged. We were going through our own storm. And Dawn shared a story of when they first came to Ethiopia. When they first came, in their first year, Dawn said it was really a dark time in her own life. She said she missed their family and their friends back home. Back then, there wasn't as easy ways to communicate. She spent lots of time crying, and all she could see was the dirtiness, the poverty, the darkness, the disease, the trash, the smells that she smelled, people living in cardboard boxes, sewage in the streets. She hated that place. After the first year, Steve and Dawn left Ethiopia to go back home to raise money to be long-term missionaries in Ethiopia. And Dawn was wrestling with the fact that she didn't want to go. How can you raise money? How can you stand in front of a church and say, God has called us to be missionaries to Ethiopia, but I hate it. I don't want to live there. She said that's what it felt like every time they would tell their story. How is it that you feel like, okay, God wants me to do it, but I don't want to? During that time, her husband, Steve, when they would talk, he would share about the desperation in Ethiopia, but he would also talk about the beauty of Ethiopia, the beautiful people and the beautiful landscape. He kept saying that in the capital city of Addis, it's surrounded on 3 sides by a huge, beautiful mountain range. And after hearing him say that a couple times, Dawn confronted him and said, why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep making it sound like it's better than it is? There's no mountains there. You're just trying to make it sound beautiful. When they returned to Ethiopia, she didn't want to go. She struggled every day. She cried, begging God, take us home. One morning, she was sitting on the porch of their house. Through her tears, she just missed her mom and dad. She missed her family. She missed home. She cried out to God, God, why did you bring us here? Why won't you help us? Why won't you help me? She looked down at her Bible that morning, and the verse she read was Psalm 121, 1 through 2. It says, I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. She read that verse sitting on her porch, and she looked up. And for the first time in over a year, she saw the mountains. From the porch of her house, you could see mountains. The mountains Steve had talked about that surround that beautiful city. She had never seen them before. And you could see them from her porch. How did she miss them? Because sometimes when you're in the storm, your eyes are focused on the wrong thing. Sometimes in the storm, you can't see what's true and good and right. Sometimes when we're in the storm, we only see the circumstances, but not the God of the circumstances, the God who's bigger than the circumstances. It changes your perspective when you begin to look to Jesus and fix your eyes on him. That day, Dawn began to see Jesus. She began to pursue him and thank him for bringing her there. It was 10 years later in Ethiopia that Dawn shared that story with us. And then when we left Ethiopia, they continued to be missionaries who impacted hundreds and thousands of people's lives in Ethiopia. You see, the one thing that's true is the storms are going to come. You may be in one right now. I don't know what your circumstances are that you're facing. Maybe it's health issues, relationship struggles, financial setbacks, past failures and regrets. But no matter what storm you walk through, I want you to remember two things. You may not realize that the God who made you and knows you and loves you has always been with you, and he's never left, even though it's felt like it. And if you just lift your eyes from your circumstances and look to him, you will see that what if the storm is not just happening to you? What if it's happening for you? What if it's happening for you? See, I don't think you can see that without Jesus. I don't think you can see hope without lifting your eyes. See Jesus. Who is this man that the wind and the waves obey him? He's Jesus. He's been there the whole time. You can look to him. You can listen to him. You can love him. You can lean on him. You can live for him, because in him is hope in the midst of the storm. Will you pray with me?